Good evening, and thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Lucky. I'd also like to thank Dr. Little, Larry Little, who is actually one of the stars of Chocolate Soldiers, who's here munching on a sandwich. So I wasn't quite sure what to do tonight or how to do it, and I'm going to talk a little bit, try and fill in some gaps, if you will, and then we'll screen it, and I'll say a few things afterwards, perhaps, and then we can do a Q&A. I just want to give you a little bit of background about the film, the context, the situation. So the story of during World War II, approximately 140,000 African Americans were stationed in Great Britain up to D-Day, 6 June 1944. But the story of Great Britain for African Americans was really a story about race. If it wasn't about the whole issue of race, then we wouldn't be having this conversation and it would be no documentary. And so the deal is that these 140,000 men and women go to Great Britain. They come from a segregated American society, and they go to Great Britain, and they are welcomed. They are treated like Americans. They are treated like first-class citizens. They're treated like human beings, and for many of them, it is the first time in their lives they've been treated as equals by whites. And so as a result of that experience, everybody gets changed. The British get changed, the African Americans get changed. So that's a lot of the context of what the environment was for these men and women who go to Great Britain. And as I said, America at the time there were these social issues involving Jim Crow, racism, segregation, etc. And for many people, going to Great Britain was just an experience that I think initially they had a hard time grasping, particularly if they came from the South, because their treatment there was just so radically different. So the war starts in 1941, and as part of the background of this, African Americans made up 9% of the military. There was a quota system in the U.S. military at the time which said that African Americans could make up no more than 9% of the military. That was roughly our percentage of the total population. And so that was what their situation was. Now, blacks in the military at that time were largely relegated to service and supply, quartermaster, those kinds of positions. As the war went on, you did see African Americans flying planes, the Tuskegee Airmen, that you're probably all familiar with, the 761st Tank Battalion, and you also had African Americans fighting in Europe in various units, particularly the 92nd Infantry Division fought in Italy. But also what came out of that time in Europe was a group of men, and you're going to hear a little bit about them in the film. There were 2,221. I won't give you all the details because it is in the film, but these men their participation in the military was revolutionary because of, in essence, they were the first integrated troops in U.S. military history. They fought they were the first African-American soldiers to fight with white combat units. And all of this came about as a result of desperation and during the Battle of the Bulge. So for African Americans, whether you were in the military or not, there was this campaign that was going on. It started in 1943 by the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, and it was called the Double V campaign. And basically, the Pittsburgh Courier was one of the major black newspapers in the country. And so they developed this campaign called the Double V, where they were saying, we as African Americans have to fight Nazism and fascism overseas, and we have to fight Jim Crow and racism at home. And so African Americans saw themselves as fighting two wars during World War II. So again, as they go back to the United Kingdom, one of the problems in the United Kingdom was that American democracy was put on display for most of the world, because here we are fighting, we're representing freedom, justice, the American way. And when these 140,000 African Americans come to Great Britain, the United States imports Jim Crow to Great Britain. And all of a sudden, there's this contradiction. We're fighting for freedom, democracy, but at the same time, there's a large part of the American population that is treated as second-class citizens. So when the black GIs come to Great Britain, they bring the culture, they bring the dancing, they bring the music, and they just bring a different way of life. But the biggest concern, and again, I'm just hitting this in a very sketchy way, the biggest concern or the biggest issue in Great Britain centered around interracial dating. All American soldiers had more money than anyone else in World War II. The base pay for an American soldier was $50, which was a lot of money. And so, you know, you go to Great Britain and all of a sudden you have $50, you have this money. American soldiers had all these luxuries in terms of food and other support systems that the British had not had in years. And so all of a sudden you have 140,000 mostly African American men, and they're dating British women. And that creates problems all the way up to Churchill and Roosevelt, because there are all these political concerns about that. And as a result of that, there was a lot of violence in Great Britain during the war. There were 3 wholesale riots in Great Britain, Bristol, Bamber Bridge, Leicester, where black and white soldiers fought each other with weapons. In Bamber Bridge, for example, which is up north, black and white American soldiers fought each other with machine guns and rifles in this little town. And an African American soldier was killed. But this is an example of the climate that existed in Great Britain. And again, this whole thing about interracial dating was a major problem, particularly for Southern whites, because that was just something that wouldn't have happened. So one of the things the Army did to try and cool this out was they came up with a pass system. So for example, depending upon where you were, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, whites would go into town for recreation. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturdays, blacks would go into town for recreation. And all this was to prevent the violence and the conflicts that was so widespread in Great Britain. Most of this stuff, and you'll see some images, some pictures that most Americans did not see during the war, and most Americans have never seen. And when you see them, you'll understand why. But most of this information never made it back to the US during the war. And so a lot of what we really know about it has been told by historians after the fact, or if you're fortunate enough to talk to some of the men and women who actually went to Great Britain. Last thing before I turn this on, it's in Great Britain that I stumbled across the women. I was in Birmingham. I was doing research, and I ran across a unit of 688 Postal Battalion, 6,888th Postal Battalion. It was a battalion of African American women, WACS, Women's Army Corps. They went to Great Britain in January 1945, and their role was to sort mail. So they sorted mail for 4 million GIs on the European mainland in combat, but they also sorted mail for the whole United Kingdom. And in some cases, these were people who hadn't received mail in a couple of years. And so I stumbled across them, and I never, you know, when I think war, I think men. And so when I came across these women, it led to other things. And the final thing I'll say about the women, which I thought was very interesting, one of the stories that was spread about African Americans was that African Americans had tails. And that I've talked to a number of African American GIs, and they told me that when they were in Great Britain or France or even Germany, little kids in particular would come up behind them and, you know, tap them or squeeze them on the rear end, searching for their tail. And I talked to Major Charity Adams, who was the commander of the 688. She was handpicked by Mary McLeod Bethune to take this battalion of women overseas. But I talked to her in the interview. I interviewed her for about 2 hours. And she told me the story about the women was that women's tales would not come out until midnight. And so they were up under their dresses. So one night in Birmingham, England, she assembled the entire battalion of women, 825 women, marched them through the streets at midnight in Birmingham, England, so people could see that they did not have tails. And that was her way of handling it. So this gives you some overview of the kind of tension that existed in Great Britain during the war. But when all is said and done, I think it was an overwhelmingly positive experience both for Brits and for the African American soldiers. So without further ado, I hope I pushed the right button and we'll see chocolate soldiers from the USA. Chocolate soldiers. Questions? Anything? Yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Best thing I can say is the 1 million African American men and women who fought in World War II directly made my life better, without question.
Yeah, I was wondering, after returning from war, was there any trouble sort of with the war medals and things and awards being given? Was that sort of a
yes. During World War II, during the war, no blacks were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. What's interesting about the 2,221, now you got to remember they didn't go into combat until March 1945. The war was over May 8th, so they were in combat for about 2 months. They won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor in 60 days. And when you take into account that there were fewer than 400 of those medals given out in the entire war, I think that's very significant. And so these men did not get their medals until most of them had passed away. The last, they got them 50, 60 years later. I think under Clinton, and the last one maybe under Bush the second. Yeah.
President Obama actually gave two to husband and wife.
Okay. World War II?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
As a follow-up to your response about the volunteers, I don't know, were they those who resigned their appointments? Was that ever corrected in terms of being restored?
Not that I know of. One of the big issues for these men at the end of the war, when the war ended, the Army tried to send them back to their old units, quartermaster, etc., and they resisted. So if you notice, we have the titles of their, 1st Infantry, 9th Armored Division, etc. Some of them actually went back to their units, and some were able to be discharged from the new units, the all-white units that they had joined. So it was catch as catch can. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna, I actually had 2 questions. One is, I just wanted to comment about, I think last name was Brodus, Sergeant Brodus.
Ambrose Brodus.
It's amazing how absolutely visceral the emotions are for him after all these years. I mean, it was just such a moving part of the documentary that it sort of just overtook him like that, and I just think that's and even the woman, I can't think
Mary
of her name,
Raglan.
that you can just sense the pride and
It never leaves.
I mean, I think you capture it wonderfully.
Thank you.
The way that just the way that it affects them still. My question is about the women, the black women, and the one who go over as wags. And when she's talking, when they're talking about how these soldiers could dance and they're in the clubs and they're dancing, with these Brits, right?
Right.
And I'm wondering, was there any resentment by black women? I mean, listen, I'm black.
You mean by
if the black women were, wondering
yeah.
you guys are dating me, so white women? Are you dating us? Are you overlooking?
Okay.
Are we going to hear about that in Invisible Warriors?
No, because that's domestic. Here's what the women told. Here's what the women told me. Okay. Here's. See, let me go back. Invisible Warriors was originally about African American women, military and civilian. It started getting crowded, so the third documentary of my trilogy will be on the Women's Army Corps. Okay, assuming there's some of that. So the 688 didn't arrive in Birmingham, England until January 45. At that time, most of the black soldiers, most of the American soldiers had already left. But they did tell me that there was resentment from the black men toward them for dating British men.
The nerve of
The nerve of them. Okay. And of course the British people invited them in for tea and all that kind of stuff. So some of these women did date British men. Yeah.
You knew I was going to ask that, right?
Well, no, I didn't. You're the first one that ever asked me that.
I saw that one couple got married. Were there many got married? And once they got married, I mean, did they come back here or did they stay in
This couple here, he came back one time. Well, he was discharged here in 45. He worked odd jobs to get passage on a ship back to England. They got married. He came back here one time after that. That was to bring his wife because she wanted to see America. That was the only time he came back. Now, there were some interesting things. Normally, you have to get your commanding officer to get married. So what would often happen in Great Britain, a guy, and I interviewed one he's not in here, but I interviewed him, he has a child. There's also the story of the brown babies, okay? And he wanted to get married to this woman, and the next thing he knows, he's shipped to another part of England, then he's sent to Europe, and so it's years before he sees the woman and his child again. And that was fairly common. They were not allowing black men to bring British women home. There were only a handful who actually got married anyway. There was one particular case in Virginia, I don't recall the name, but he did come back here with his British bride and went to Virginia. They arrested him, put him in prison, and deported her.
Really?
Yeah. So for black for black GIs, you couldn't really bring a British. If you were in the North, maybe, but the Army wasn't going to help you marry a British woman. They would make it as difficult as possible for you.
One more thing I have a colleague, I'm a member of the American Legion,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of my mentors was a member of the 688, right?
Okay.
And she left me a whole bunch of papers, right?
Okay.
So let me see if I
Okay.
can look those up.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
What did the black population look like in Great Britain before the black American soldiers came over?
Okay. I'm sorry. Go
Did
ahead.
they have, I'm sure they had one, but
There were fewer than 5,000 blacks in Great Britain prior to the war. Most of them were located in port areas, okay? And so most Brits had never seen a black person except in American movies. And the role of, and the images of blacks in movies, were not complimentary. So the few blacks that were in Great Britain, like I said, there weren't that many, fewer than 5,000, and they were in port areas. And they were probably from various places in the empire, who were involved in, merchant seamen, that type of stuff.
so what do you think made them so accepting of the black American soldiers?
I think there were several things. One, they came to fight Hitler. I mean, and they saw them as Americans. It's really kind of peculiar because the British were largely responsible for a lot of the racial attitudes that still permeate throughout the world, but the average British person did not generally hold those attitudes because they had no context, they had no interaction with black soldiers. Now, keep in mind, all Brits were not that crazy about having black soldiers in their country. And part of it again was there's this competition. A lot of it was coming from the men, because there's this competition for women again. And for women in England, it was a smorgasbord of men. I mean, because you had men from all over Europe, all the free French, all the people that escaped from Europe to fight another day, and then you had Americans. And so if you were a single woman or even a married woman in Great Britain, there were like men everywhere.
Men.
Huh?
It was raining men.
Yeah, it was raining men. Now, there was, the vicar's wife, I think of a town called Worley. She came out and made some very disparaging comments about black soldiers, about not wanting them. And as I said, the discussion about having blacks, Churchill and Roosevelt were going through this push-pull about having black soldiers in Great Britain at all. But ultimately FDR won because we had the money, the manpower, and they needed us, so he won. But there were, everybody didn't embrace the idea of having black soldiers. And the last part to that is the numbers are a little fuzzy, but people estimate somewhere between maybe 2,000 and 3,000, there were 2,000 and 3,000 brown babies, who are now, the oldest would be about 70. And many of them were taken from their mothers in some places and put in orphanages, and in other places they were given up. And what's interesting, that was supposed to be part of this, but I didn't have the money to include the brown babies in it. But there's still this undercurrent that people don't want to talk about, particularly the women, who don't want to talk about their children that they had. And I've talked to some of the brown babies, and they had a very difficult time in Great Britain growing up there. Yeah. And I guess the final thing, the racial attitudes in Great Britain changed. One thing the Brits knew, y'all are going home, so they knew that they were just visitors. But after the war, starting in about 50, 51, African people from the empire started coming there to live, competing for housing, jobs. And so then you had all this ugly racial stuff that in some ways is still going on today. Yeah.
There's a great novel by Carol Phillips, Crossing the River, that actually captures a lot of that whole Second World War presence of black American soldiers in the UK.
Okay.
Including the brown baby phenomenon. So
Okay.
it's a great resource.
There's another documentary put out by this woman, Texas A&M. It's called Tiger Brides. And there's this part of Wales where there are these multicultural women who marry African American soldiers. And it might be something you might want to look at. I mean, to get her here. She's at Texas A&M, and it's called Tiger Brides, and she just finished it earlier this year, I think. And it's really interesting. It explores this racial dynamic again between African American soldiers and British women. Yeah. Yes.
First, a kind of follow-up from the question of what drew British women to accept and then to respond. When you were talking about in the introduction, it occurred to me to think, at least, or it just thoughts came, that it likely was the two reasons, one being, as one of the people in the documentary says, it's the first colored person I'd ever seen. Boom. And so with that, and the empire, colonialism was still really, really big. So no need to deal with that. But what occurred to me was this was a matter of class. Here was somebody with money who was not shy. And oh my goodness, this would be good. And I think that would be the case with both sides, with the African American women and British men, African American men with British women.
Right.
Is that a reasonable?
Well, I think as John Wood said, he realized that they were of the same class.
Yes.
And so that's how he was treated, but by the Brits. Things are a little bit sketchier with the women because I think they were in England about 2 to 3 months before they went to France. But I think a lot of the same thing was going on. Men being men, I mean, they're women and they had money. And Americans just had money. I mean, you're flying chocolate cake across the ocean. And so they had all this stuff that the British people just didn't have. And so that was a selling point for them. And they're different. And they're introducing these new cultural art forms to Great Britain in terms of the dance, the music. So I think that was part of the acceptance. And Britain was a very dreary place in the sense that they had been in war since 1939. They had rationing. Rationing didn't end in Britain until 1952. So these guys come with money and all this stuff, and they made their life easier. They brought a little bit of sunshine to Great Britain, which is always hard to find. Yeah.
In every way.
Yeah.
I mean, I would think that there would be some present who are under 30 who might have wonderment right now of whether what we have seen is or is not anything other than a very powerful but historical and hence at arm's length portrayal, with the exception of when tears came to my eyes and our eyes, as Dr. Lucky was saying, after all these years. I guess my question is, would it make any difference to you as educator, to you as human person, to you as African American, and to you as one of all men, that people in this room under 30 might say, okay, I got my credit for, extra credit for, or whatever, and that was not a bad thing, and this was a really good documentary, but I got stuff to do, and I sure hope that this man will be quiet really soon so we can close and go home. What is the lesson that if you were somewhere just under 30, maybe just over 30, right? Well, we can't trust anybody over 30.
Yeah, I remember that.
But because this is what I think, among other things, who's it and what's her name are thinking ought to happen.
Yeah. Well, I basically believe that you have to understand yesterday, because if you don't, today never makes sense. And I think watching Chocolate Soldiers is just another piece to the long journey that African Americans have had to full citizenship. And while we gained full citizenship in 1965, I personally don't believe that we have full social citizenship. And I think some of that played out yesterday in the elections. So I think you need to understand that these are the same men and women who were the backbone of the civil rights movement. People like Medgar Evers, Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend Joseph Lowery. All these guys were World War II veterans, and they all went to Europe. And so I think the big lesson is to try and understand this another part of where we are today. And you have to understand we don't give history enough attention in our society and our culture. And it's the only way today will ever make sense if you know yesterday. And so I think that's what one of the things that Chocolate Soldiers does. And today we routinely see an integrated military. But my take on it, from what I've seen, we didn't have our first spiritually integrated war was Desert Storm. Vietnam, we were physically integrated, but not socially. And I think Desert Storm was the first, shall we say, spiritually integrated war in our country's history. Yeah. Yes.
One last thing. I noticed when you were commenting on saying, and that they receive resentment from black men because they were dating white. In some ways, we see that same dynamic at play here at Villanova, right? Especially, very oftentimes, the black guys, it's okay for them to date the white women, but when the black women try to date the white guys, the very guys who are dating the white women will turn around and they will show resentment towards the black women for doing almost the same thing they did.
Right.
Right. And I'm just kind of wondering, well, I don't know why I'm wondering. I think it's just really interesting that kind of dynamic still, still exists, right? I mean, you're talking about something from the 1940s, and yet it is 2014, and one can suggest that same double standard, and it's really a double standard, right? Still exists even here on this campus when it comes to racial relations.
Yeah.
Right? And I guess there's no question in there. I just wanted to
Okay.
have something to talk to my students about.
Well, as another side to what was going on in Great Britain, Gurley, she worked at the Red Cross Club in Bristol, and it was a black Red Cross Club, and there was a white Red Cross Club about 2 blocks apart. And you had blackout. Her husband was in the British Army, so she worked with the black soldiers, and often they would walk her home. And she told me that white soldiers would throw money in front of her as she would come down the street. Okay, and if the word got out that you dated a black soldier, white soldiers would not date you, deal with you, or whatever. So you had a lot of that. All I can say is that's how men are. That's not a high endorsement, but yeah.
Okay, well, being how men are, I then want to bring this to the present and bring it home.
Okay.
My wife, before she was my wife, when we were first dating, was surrounded by young African-American men who were saying to her, Flossie, what are you doing dating that white boy? She was the sweetheart of one of the fraternities where she was in college. I was in college 7.5 minutes away. And, well, it's not how far you are, it's how fast you grow. And that was, she had curfew, so I would say, it's okay, we're just 7.5 minutes away. And we would be, but here's a point I want to make, a non-answer to the non-question that Dr. Will had. Yes, it was the case in World War II, in the Korean War, in Vietnam, and in 1967 in Nashville, Tennessee, and in 2014 in Villanova, Pennsylvania. True. I grew up as a poor boy in the white South. I was a poor boy growing up in the white South. And yet, it was my 2 uncles, one of whom lied about his age and was volunteered and was accepted for World War II, and then second uncle, who joined so he could be with his brother jumping out of airplanes during Korea, and they both were in Vietnam. When my wife and I became man and wife and husband and wife in Greensboro, the first interracial couple to be married after the Virginia Loving decision. And the people there, they had Christmas gifts, but my wife, well, we were getting married. I'd say, are these for the bride and groom to be? Well, you can have one if you want them. They were, little Christmas gifts. We came here. This was my first job. We had 2 little brown boys. They're okay. They're way okay.
Cool.
My mother asked, my wife's mother asked, our fathers didn't have to ask because we knew, each of us in turn, what about the children? And we were of one mind. We'll have to ask them when they're ready to be asked.
Okay.
And they have issues. Of course they have issues,
Yeah.
but they're here. So when I ask you about under 30, I'm just here to say, oh, by the way, I teach at Villanova.
Okay.
And I've had students who, every student I have had for the past 10 years knows far more about reality of variety, diversity, sort of, than they ever had any reason to think they would when they saw me go Southern in a classroom, which I do if you're not talking. I just say, what's wrong with you, girl? In a classroom and stuff. You're just sitting there and you're just being quiet, all right? But we're talking about really interesting things. I'm trying to get you to imagine for a moment. And when I say I go Southern, you don't hear me be quite so Southern as I do when I'm looking at you and saying, what's wrong with you, girl? Then you begin to pay attention. Next time I call on you, you'll have something. But I want to bring this to the present, to the personal, and say, yes, it still happens. Dr. Little can go to his class and says he knows somebody. He actually knows he knows several people. But what you're doing is taking me and the rest of us over 30 back to memories that were first-hand memories back in the day, which we would not have had an opportunity to have without what you've done. And so when I just said, remember, that was just pure performance at the very beginning when I just said thank you and shut up. You
Thank
thought
you.
I was a shy young man who maybe someday, but I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
That's spectacular.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.